So a lot of you have commented on our videos asking us questions such as, how do I put fruit in beer?
Turns out there's about a million ways to do it, so we're going to go over about 24 of those for you today.
We're going to do our best, but before we kind of dive in, we want to go over a couple of common misconceptions when it comes to fruited beer, especially among the fledgling novice beer drinkers of the world.
Yeah. The first one is just the sort of myth that beer with fruit in it isn't real beer, and I think this has to do with a lot of the mass-produced, mass-marketed beers that are available out there.
A lot of them use their fruity mechanisms in a way such that the beer ends up tasting sweet, sometimes cidery, sometimes like a juice of sorts, and doesn't really stay true to what the original style should be when it comes to adding fruits to beer.
Oftentimes you get that really artificial flavor from the whatever extracts or whatever they're adding to their beer, but the reality is that that's not true with beer at all.
Also, Logan just used the word reality.
The reality is that adding fruit to beer will almost never give you that sort of a flavor profile. In fact, it's usually quite the opposite, which brings us to our next myth about fruited beers.
Fruit beer, I don't like sweet things.
Oh man, we shouldn't drink any fruit beer then.
The actuality-ness, which is also a word, just like Logan's reality, is that when you add fruit to the beer, you're adding fermentable sugars, which oftentimes dries out, turns into alcohol, and leaves you with all the acidity, the bitterness, the tannin, all the extra flavors of the fruit, and none of the sweetness.
So, more often than not, fruited beers are dry beers.
That said, let's jump into fruiting and the ways to fruit beer, and we're gonna kind of go by style of fruit. And so we're gonna start off with citrus fruit. The most common way to use citrus fruit is actually to use the peel and/or zest.
Peels and zest from citrus fruits are going to be generally used as a secondary addition or sort of post-fermentation. This is the easiest way to add any extra punch to any pale-colored beer, anywhere from a wheat or blonde ale all the way through your big, robust IPAs. The zest is actually going to add a little bit different character. Generally, you're going to get all of the oils from the fruit in that zest, so that's going to leave you with a huge punch of aromatics, but really not a whole lot for flavor. Whereas the peel itself is going to add a little bit more kind of pithy or rininess to the beer, which can end up adding some bitterness. I usually like to add the peels themselves as a flame out or whirlpool addition to the beer. And those are kind of the two ways to get a nice quick punch of aromatic, especially for an already citrusy IPA.
And we add those into secondary after a lot of fermentation because a lot of the flavor that comes from that is from the oils. It's an aromatic component, and that doesn't get dissolved into the beer with water and beer sugars alone. So it actually needs alcohol to act as an emulsifier, basically, to be able to dissolve that oil into the beer and give you that full experience.
Next, let's talk about the juices. Adding fruit juice to a beer is a pretty common practice, and I think this sort of kind of builds off of that whole misconception about fruit adding sweetness, where a lot of people will end up adding a half gallon of a fruit juice or a fruit juice concentrate to a beer only to end up with a dry, acidic beer. And I think when done in the right way, this can actually be highly beneficial.
When you're adding citrus juices specifically, you can expect to end up with some fermentation from the citrus juice. Whether or not you end up with more or less alcohol depends on if the gravity of your beer or your wort originally was higher or lower than the gravity of the juice that you add. That math should add up to you. But what you're left with is basically fermented. Think of it when you ferment a cider and it ferments completely dry. You end up with none of that sweetness, almost a champagne-like quality. And that's kind of what you're getting off this in beer. You're getting all the leftover acidity, all the leftover, sometimes aromatics, but like tannic and bitey qualities, and not as much of the actual juice flavor.
Yeah, a lot of times what I say when you are adding citrus juice to a beer is that on top of what Peter mentioned, it'll generally make that beer a little bit softer on that bitterness factor, but also a little bit brighter just because you're kind of popping up those acidic notes.
And it really plays well with beers that have a naturally bigger body. Let's say you're adding a lot of oats or wheats or heavy adjuncts that leave some residual mouthfeel and flavor and some sort of sweetness in the beer, because the perception of sweetness from those components mixed with the flavors that you get from the juice left over, since none of the sweetness of the juice is in the final beer, can give you the perception of the actual fruit in the final product.
these are generally going to be added at any point really during the fermentation. You can wait until secondary, but you can also add them right at the beginning. It's really not going to matter. What's in there is already in there, and as long as you're not boiling it, I don't see how you can go wrong.
Speaking of boiling, there is one time that I like to use or citrus fruit specifically, in either the boil or the whirlpool.
The beer of the day is not officially sponsored by Yaya Brewing Company, our neighbors down the road.
So moving on, when we do add citrus fruit to the boil or the end of the boil in the whirlpool or hop stand, what I like to do actually is add cross sections. Cross sections are if you were to take the butt and the head off of, like, let's say an orange, and you were to slice it longitudinally.
Sure.
Slice it longitudinally and actually do a stand with that. This is going to give you kind of the best of both worlds, and the thing that I like most about this methodology is you get kind of that meat, that deeper fruit character off of it.
As well as the pith, the rind, and a little bit of zest.
Exactly. So you kind of get the best of all of that. It's really good combined with doing a zesting in secondary, because you do lose some of the aromatics just with it being at a hotter temperature.
Yeah. Which I think kind of the last note on what you're hitting on right now is that I've done this in the past, and one thing I've noticed is that it's probably the most delicate of a flavor profile when you're adding the citrus fruit to beer. So, don't be afraid to throw, if you're going to add this into your boil, not just one or two, but, 8, 10 different citrus, whatever you want to throw, be it oranges, limes, lemons, you name it. And then lastly, we're going to talk about citrus extracts. These are going to be added right before packaging, and they are going to be what they're going to be. They're going to give you that flavor profile that if you do want to kind of hit the same sort of flavor that those macro guys are distributing, get a big punch from it, and get some sweetness back in there, the extracts are honestly the way to go.
One thing quick about extracts is they are something you definitely need to experiment with. Extracts are not something that's plug and play, universal across all extracts that we can just tell you exactly how to add them. So you're going to have to experiment with playing around with a couple of them, and sometimes that means they're going to taste really great with the extract by itself. Sometimes that means your best combination is going to be some extract and some other real fruiting mechanism.
We're going to talk about extracts throughout other fruit flavor profiles as we go, but let me just kind of tell you my methodologies for using an extract, and that's going to be to pull a pint off of your finished beer, measure out with a pipette, typically is what we use here actually, and then measure out a very specific amount of the extract, add it to the beer, get it to that flavor profile you're looking for, and then scale that up for the rest of your batch.
So that about sums it up for the citrus fruit that we have here. Let's go on to the next major fruit that we see added to beer, which is going to be berries.
Berries are my favorite fruits, honestly. They have such a wide variety of flavor profiles, of acidity, of pungency between each berry variety.
And that's because there's so many different kinds out there. There's strawberries.
There's like blueberries.
Blackberries.
Raspberries.
Boysenberries.
Marionberries.
Huckleberries.
Blueberries.
Thimbleberries.
Schnozberries. Oh, wait, that's just for us. All right, anyway. One thing with berries is that they are going to need a little bit of prep work to them, though, because at this point we're starting to get into these things called pectins, which if you've ever had jelly or jam, that's what you got. And we don't want our beer turning into jelly or jam, right?
All your berries have these little tiny fortresses around the goodness in them, and we need to break down those walls with our catapults and trebuchets.
And or pectic enzyme. And so this is one way to do it. What I actually do is I will take my berries and I will put them in a food processor, make them into a slurry, add some pectic enzyme, and then another essential step, and unless you're going to be pasteurizing or treating them in other ways, is to add metabisulfite powder, or campden tablets are the same thing. That's going to kill any wild microbes that might be in them. At this point, now we'll take that sort of slurry, I'll put it in a sanitized vessel, let it sit for a day before I rack my beer, usually my finished beer, on top of it, and that's the only occasion where I ever actually allow this beer to go through a secondary fermentation because of the sugars from the berries.
The other way to do the same process basically is, instead of chemically, we do it mechanically, which means to explode the cell walls, to break down that fortress, the same thing that pectic enzyme does, you can do by freezing. Freezing causes the water molecules inside the cells of the berries to expand, and explodes the cell walls, releasing and breaking down those pectins. The second step in that, the sanitation step, kind of serves a twofold function, and that's going to be pasteurization. When I do that, I basically bring my fruit mixture up to a near boil for about 5 minutes. And this serves to kill off any wild bacteria that's going to be on there, or it caramelizes some of the sugars just slightly, which actually helps you extract a little bit more sweet and mature flavor.
Speaking about caramelizing sugars, that is actually a great thing to do if you want to actually maintain a little bit of that sweetness and a little bit of complexity, because like we've mentioned already, the sugars from fruits are more or less 100% fermentable, so otherwise you will end up with a very, very dry beer. And depending on the intensity of the berry that you happen to be using, this might be a good idea because it might actually retain some of that character of the original fruit.
When thinking about fruiting beer in any style, it's important to remember that when you taste fruit, the flavor that you perceive is largely based on the sugar content of that fruit. That sugar content does not exist, and so imagining the flavor of your final product, you have to kind of fill in the gaps between what fruit tastes like with and without sugar. To take this a next step further from the pasteurization step and in holding with that caramelization to retain sugar flavor, there's something else you can do with these fruit, which is to kind of make a concentrate / syrup.
Adding these concentrates to secondary is a great option. You're going to end up with that little bit of re-fermentation again, but you can also add this right at packaging. With that said, if you have any live yeast, they're still going to want to ferment it, so if you add it at packaging, you definitely want to keep that product cold to keep any re-fermentation at bay, but you should get some sweetness, you should get a lot of berry complexity as a result, which I think kind of brings us right to the end of this guy, which is adding extracts. And I think my personal opinion on berry extracts is that they actually kind of suck.
They almost always taste like cough syrup.
Yeah, they pretty much, I think it just has to do with the way that they're made. I really would not recommend most berry extracts.
Yeah, or at least do it with a combination of actual real fruit. There is one more thing to consider that's not a very commonly done style when it comes to berry fruiting beers, and that is actually adding fresh berries to your whirlpool and or end of boil. What that does is instead of giving you that sweet berry essence that you get when you actually eat berries, like that perception that you get that tastes like a berry, you can actually get notes of like woodiness and some earthiness off of the berries, and some brighter tannic astringency or brightness. Very different profile if you add the berries raw to the boil.
So a little more complexity.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on to probably our most finicky of fruits, which I know I've had all kinds of issues with, and that is the stone fruits. These are going to be your peaches, your plums, your apricots. Anything else?
So let's dive into why stone fruits are so finicky. The biggest reason is, first of all their flavors are very much locked up in their body and structure.
Yeah, so like we mentioned before, pectic enzyme with some of the berries. Stone fruits are a must. Stone fruits are notorious for having really, really high amounts of pectins in them. So honestly, for these, I recommend combining the two methods we mentioned with berries, which are freezing and adding pectic enzyme.
And if you want to make a concentrate at the end to really hammer home that sweet flavor,
yep,
do it all.
And then make a concentrate with them, just because they're going to be a little bit more delicate, and they're just not going to punch through like some of those berries will, or especially the citrus fruit will. But these guys do have a little trick up their sleeve, and that is the actual pits. Hence being the name stone fruit.
Yes. So we all know Logan likes to dip his stones into his beers, but what he's really doing is adding his nuts.
What Peter means by that is actually the nutty flavors that can be derived from a lot of the pits in stone fruits. But that has to do with things like tannins, things like vanillins that are part of those pits, and also a little bit in the skins, depending on the stone fruit you're using. And what I actually love to do is leave these in my fermenter for anywhere from maybe a couple days all the way up to a couple weeks to really extract some of that complexity. And that can add to specifically sour beers, especially true sours, right?
This really brings us to where stone fruits shine, at least in my mind, which is beers that are naturally on that drier side.
Yep.
You get some complexity with the actual fruit themselves. I'm thinking in my mind something like a peach, but when you add the pit to the aging process or the fermentation process, getting some of those vanillins and tannins actually builds body and mouthfeel, as well as the perception of sweetness while still leaving you with a very dry beer, indicative of what you want off of a proper saison or a farmhouse beer.
Yeah, we really haven't talked much about styles up until now, but yeah, saisons and sours are really where these shine. Otherwise, for the other fruits that we've talked about, those can go in such a wide variety of beers that we kind of are going to leave that guy up to you.
Have fun with it, guys.
Anyway, is that it? Oh.
That pretty much rounds out stone fruit. There are definitely more nuances that we can go into with all of these, but I think we're going to kind of take a turn left, a sharp turn left, and we're going to talk about some stranger fruits, things like watermelons to add into, and then some fruits with some unique properties like enzymes.
Yeah, these sort of fall into our last oddball category, and I'm sure people have had the cucumber beers and the watermelon beers, and honestly, these fruits naturally are so watery and so delicate that you really have a hard time getting those flavors from the natural fruit, which is, I think, the only situation where I personally would recommend just buying an extract, dosing it properly.
Yeah, I have seen people do it successfully. A lot of times it's just cross-section infusion. You throw it right in your bride tank and get that kind of Randall-esque kind of quality. Usually with these, you want that to be a very short contact time. Or with watermelon specifically, I've seen people make concentrates and actually kind of boil that down. But again,
I can see that, yeah.
There's a lot of ways to go about that, but those are more specialties and probably something to take case by case.
Yep.
Let's go into some stranger fruits, though. Let's talk about things like bananas.
Speaking of bananas, I actually know of a lot of people that make banana wine, which tends to be this very full-bodied wine. And so I actually researched it, and it turns out bananas are full of dextrins, which also in the beer world are known for giving beer a lot of its body and mouthfeel.
So next time you're making anything, just substitute your carrot pills for bananas. Because why not?
No, actually, I don't recommend that. But if you do have a beer, say you're trying to brew a wheat beer, you throw some other fruit in it, and it ends up a little bit thinner than you like it to, adding a few bananas to secondary might not be the end of the world, right?
Might not be a bad idea. Speaking of maybe mashing bananas, there is a fun property that bananas actually have. They actually are full of amylase enzyme.
Oh, well, there you go.
So, yeah, bananas in the mash could theoretically help with your efficiency, or it could be something to add. Let's say you overshoot and you denature some enzymes. Bananas might be a solution. I don't know. I haven't used it, but apparently they're full of amylase.
Speaking of enzymes, though, we found some other fruits, right?
We did find some other fruits.
Is it papaya?
Mango is the other main one.
Mango also has amylase, and yeah. So, mashing with mangoes.
I used to work at Hops and Drops, or formerly Hop Jacks, but their beer, their wheat beer made for them by, I think, Northwest Brewing Company, actually mashes mangoes in their wheat beer. And I don't know if that's just to get some extra conversion or if it's for the actual flavor. It's barely mango-y at all, but kind of a fun fact.
Yeah, I love that idea.
We did have somebody comment a very strange mash edition on our recent live stream.
Oh, yeah. Avocados, apparently.
Which I'm curious about. I want to give that a go. Avocados have lipase in them. That's an enzyme that breaks down fats. And so I don't know if that's the reason behind it or just kind of an added bonus. But this person said that he made an avocado cerveza, and it gave it a creamy mouthfeel that actually really helped fill out the beer and made it taste good.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned that, lipase breaks down fats, right?
Yeah.
Peanut butter. Are we going to make an avocado peanut butter beer? I don't know.
Ryan says yes.
Ryan's shaking
he's
his
so
head
excited.
yes.
Yeah, he's so excited back there. He's
Shaking
dancing
yes.
with joy, jumping up and down.
All right. Well, I think that pretty much sums up our video.
Yeah.
I'm about to beat Peter and connect 4 here.
That's never going to happen. If you want to send us beer, we started a hashtag Genus Rate My Beer. Send us your beer or post a picture of your beer on Instagram and tag us / use the hashtag Genus Rate My Beer. And we'll give it a judge / add it to our wall and or story. Also, like ourselves.
Yeah. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe if you love us sitting out here, which we apologize for the excessive road noise.
We apologize much less to Ryan. He's going to have to try to minimize that in post.
And otherwise, until next time on Gina's Brewing.
Cheers, guys.
Bam, it's your move. Damn it!